All right. Well, welcome to our last installment on the book of Esther. We're going to finish up the book of Esther. We just did last week. We did through chapter 7, I believe. So we're going to do 8, 9, and 10. They're really short chapters, and it kind of wraps everything up and ties up all the loose ends. So Esther chapter 8 says, on that same day, King Xerxes gave the property of Haman, the enemy of the Jews, to Queen Esther. Remember in chapter 7, Haman got hanged on the gallows that he had built for Mordecai. So that's kind of poetic justice. We like stories like that. Then Mordecai was brought before the king, for Esther had told the king how they were related. So now the king knows that Esther is a Jew and all this. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther appointed Mordecai to be in charge of Haman's property. All right, so Mordecai is now second in authority in the kingdom. He's got Haman's job now. He controls all of Haman's property, his servants, his household, his goods. Everything Haman had is now Mordecai's. Then Esther went again before the king, falling down at his feet and begging him with tears to stop the evil plot devised by Haman the Agagite against the Jews. Remember, Haman wanted to kill all the Jews. Again, the king held out the gold scepter to Esther, so she rose and stood before him. Esther said, if it please the king, and if I have found favor with him, and if he thinks it is right, and if I am pleasing to him, let there be a decree that reverses the orders of Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, who ordered that Jews throughout all the king's provinces should be destroyed. For how can I endure to see my people and my family slaughtered and destroyed? So she's pleading on behalf of her people. Now, then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, I have given Esther the property of Haman, and he has been impaled on a pole because he tried to destroy the Jews. Now go ahead and send a message to the Jews in the king's name, telling them whatever you want, and seal it with the king's signet ring. But remember that whatever has already been written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring can never be revoked. So remember, that was that whole thing about once it becomes law, once the king's signet ring is on there, sealed with his seal and his name, it's law, and it can't be changed, can't be repealed, can't be revoked, can't be altered in any way. So the mass execution of the Jews is still going forth. There's nothing they can do to stop it. So on June 25th, the king's secretaries were summoned, and a decree was written exactly as Mordecai dictated. It was sent to the Jews and to the highest officers, the governors, and the nobles of all the 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia. You look at a map, that is a huge kingdom. The decree was written in the scripts and languages of all the peoples of the empire, including that of the Jews. And the decree was written in the name of King Xerxes and sealed with the king's signet ring. Mordecai sent the dispatches by swift messengers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king's service. Best horses. They're going to get the message out there. The king's decree gave the Jews in every city authority to unite to defend their lives. They can't change the law that's been made before to annihilate them, but now they can defend themselves. It's not just a mass execution. They were allowed to kill, slaughter, and annihilate anyone of any nationality or province who might attack them or their children and wives, and to take the property of their enemies. So they can kill their attackers and take their property. The day chosen for this event throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes was March 7th of the next year. That's the date that the annihilation of the Jews was going to take place. A copy of this decree was to be issued as law in every province and proclaimed to all people, so that the Jews would be ready to take revenge on their enemies on the appointed day. So urged on by the king's command, the messengers rode out swiftly on fast horses bred for the king's service. The same decree was also proclaimed in the fortress of Susa. Then Mordecai left the king's presence, wearing the royal robe of blue and white, the great crown of gold, and an outer cloak of fine linen and purple. And the people of Susa celebrated the new decree. The Jews were filled with joy and gladness and were honored everywhere. In every province and city, wherever the king's decree arrived, the Jews rejoiced and had a great celebration and declared a public festival and holiday. And many of the people of the land became Jews themselves, for they feared what the Jews might do to them. So here we have a lot of pagans who are now becoming Jews because they see that the Jews have a God that's going to take care of them, a God that's got their back. And they're either thinking, man, I want a God like that, that's got my back, that's going to take care of me. Or they're thinking, I don't want to be on the other side of the fence from a people like this who have this kind of God that takes care of them. Either way, a lot of people were becoming Jews. So chapter 9 then, it says, on March 7th, the 2 decrees of the king were put into effect. On that day, the enemies of the Jews had hoped to overpower them, but quite the opposite happened. It was the Jews who overpowered their enemies. Imagine that. The Jews gathered in their cities throughout all the king's provinces to attack anyone who tried to harm them. But no one could make a stand against them, for everyone was afraid of them. And all the nobles of the provinces, the highest officers, the governors, and the royal officials helped the Jews for fear of Mordecai. So they've got the power of the government behind them as well as God. For Mordecai had been promoted in the king's palace, and his fame spread throughout all the provinces as he became more and more powerful. So the Jews went ahead on the appointed day and struck down their enemies with the sword. They killed and annihilated their enemies and did as they pleased with those who hated them. In the fortress of Susa itself, the Jews killed 500 men. They also killed Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Pamashta, Erisai, Eridai, and Vaisatha, the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. But they did not take any plunder. They were legally allowed to take the property of the person they killed, but it says they didn't take any. That very day, when the king was informed of the number of people killed in the fortress of Susa, he called for Queen Esther, and he said, the Jews have killed 500 men in the fortress of Susa alone, as well as Haman's 10 sons. If they have done that here, what has happened in the rest of the provinces? But now, what more do you want? It will be granted to you. Tell me, and I will do it. Esther responded, if it please the king, give the Jews in Susa permission to do again tomorrow, as they have done today, and let the bodies of Haman's 10 sons be impaled on a pole. So the king agreed, and the decree was announced in Susa. And they impaled the bodies of Haman's 10 sons. And then the Jews at Susa gathered together on March 8th and killed 300 more men. And again, they took no plunder. Meanwhile, the other Jews throughout the king's provinces had gathered together to defend their lives. They gained relief from all their enemies, killing 75,000 of those who hated them. But again, they did not take any plunder. This was done throughout the provinces on March 7th, and on March 8th they rested, celebrating their victory with a day of feasting and gladness. The Jews at Susa killed their enemies on March 7th, and again on March 8th, then rested on March 9th, making that their days of feasting and gladness. So to this day, rural Jews living in remote villages celebrate an annual festival and holiday on the appointed day in late winter, when they rejoice and send gifts of food to each other. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to the Jews near and far throughout all the provinces of King Xerxes, calling on them to celebrate an annual festival on these 2 days. He told them to celebrate these days with feasting and gladness, and by giving gifts of food to each other and presents to the poor. This would commemorate a time when the Jews gained relief from their enemies, when their sorrow was turned into gladness and their mourning into joy. So the Jews accepted Mordecai's proposal and adopted this annual custom. Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite, the enemy of the Jews, had plotted to crush and destroy them on the date determined by casting lots. The lots were called, if you remember, Purim or Pur. But when Esther came before the king, he issued a decree causing Haman's evil plot to backfire, and Haman and his sons were impaled on a sharpened pole. That is why this celebration is called Purim, because it is the ancient word for casting lots. So because of Mordecai's letter and because of what they had experienced, the Jews throughout the realm agreed to inaugurate this tradition and to pass it on to their descendants and to all who became Jews. They declared that they would never fail to celebrate these 2 prescribed days at the appointed time each year. These days would be remembered and kept from generation to generation and celebrated by every family throughout the provinces and cities of the empire. This festival of Purim would never cease to be celebrated among the Jews, nor would the memory of what happened ever die out among their descendants. Then Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, along with Mordecai the Jew, wrote another letter, putting the queen's full authority behind Mordecai's letter to establish the festival of Purim. Letters wishing peace and security were sent to the Jews throughout the 127 provinces of the empire of Xerxes. These letters established the festival of Purim, an annual celebration of these days at the appointed time, decreed by both Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther. The people decided to observe this festival just as they had decided for themselves and their descendants to establish the times of fasting and mourning. So the command of Esther confirmed the practices of Purim, and it was all written down in the records. And Jews today, Orthodox Jews today, still celebrate the Feast of Purim in celebration of the deliverance of the Jewish people. So chapter 10, the final chapter in the book of Esther, it says, King Xerxes imposed a tribute throughout his empire, even to the distant coastlands. His great achievements and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, are recorded in the book of the history of the kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew became prime minister with authority next to that of King Xerxes himself. He was very great among the Jews, who held him in high esteem because he continued to work for the good of his people and to speak up for the welfare of all their descendants. And that concludes the book of Esther. As I said at the beginning, there's no direct mention of God, but you can see God working, how God manipulated events, how God brought justice to the Jewish people, to Mordecai and Esther in particular, to the Jewish people as a whole. He threw in that little poetic justice where Haman gets impaled on the pole that he'd set up for Mordecai. It'd make a great movie of the week. You know, it's got all the elements. I know I would sit in front of the TV and just be, you know, enraptured with what's going on, and wondering how the Jews going to get out of this, and you know, how's Haman going to be figured out, and you know, is he going to win? Is the bad guy going to win? So it's really a cool story. It's even with the impalement on the poles and the Jews killing people, it's a story to read to your children or your grandchildren. And, you know, you can clean it up a little bit without altering the meaning, which, again, I think is just the fact that God works in the lives of his people. Even today, you know, we go through valleys, we go through dark times in our life. And if we would just remember that when we can't see God working, that's usually when he's doing the most, but he's doing it behind the scenes. He's manipulating things and orchestrating events so that he can bless us. And the things that he allows in our life help shape us and mold us into the people that he wants us to be, the people that he created us to be. And you know, the old saying, into each life a little rain must fall, and that's true. And God's not just going to give us an easy life. He's going to give us those struggles and stuff. Just like a butterfly, when it comes out of its cocoon, out of its chrysalis, it can't fly right then. And it's got to struggle to get out of that chrysalis, because that's what helps to strengthen its wings, so that when it gets out and those wings dry out a little bit and they're ready to fly, they can fly. If you help a butterfly out of the chrysalis, you look at it and go, oh, poor thing, let me help you out. He'll die because he won't be able to fly. So we have to have those struggles in our life to make us stronger. And but we can rest assured in the fact that God is with us every step of the way. And he's watching, and there's nothing that he doesn't see. And there's a lot that we don't see, but there's nothing that he doesn't see. And we can rest assured in the fact that he is working and manipulating things in our life to ensure the best possible outcome for whatever situation we face. I hope you enjoyed the book of Esther. We're going to do next week, we're going to go into the book of Ruth. We're going to continue this little expedition into looking at women of the Old Testament. The book of Ruth is even shorter than the book of Esther. But again, it's a very, very, very powerful story, and it it's got a aspect of it that's, I think, is really, really cool concerning the lineage of Christ and the genealogy of Christ. So till we see you next week, thanks for tuning in to Teacher Talk. God bless.